The rats are absolutely going to hate this announcement. But the rats don't run this city. We do.
This is not Ratatouille. Rats are not our friends.
Yes, folks. Welcome, Left Reckoning 89.
Hell yeah.
How to do Marxist history, the British Marxist Historians, Harvey J K. And Matt Leck with me is David Griscom. Hello, David.
Hey, brother. How you doing?
I'm doing well. I'm giddy a little bit. I'm excited. We had a great conversation with Harvey on a topic that dear to my heart. All these British historians. I'm a big Christopher Hill guy, people may know, writing about the English Revolution and the radicalism of that time period, which is where we get the levelers and the diggers and all that stuff. But it was good to talk to Harvey again. It was as Harvey said, too long, and it's also fun. I just love hearing about Harvey as a young historian himself, following around these sort of like giants, frankly, of British Marxist history, and them saying, it's all good and well, to talk to us, but can you start writing about American history? Nonetheless, one of those guys ended up writing a preface for one of these reprints, and Eric Hobsbawm, one of the guys who was most standoffish, if I remember correctly, back in the day. But so it was good to hear, because we learned of Harvey through his American history works. He really followed the advice of those guys to the point where that's how he was originally defined in my mind. And to hear about this other earlier time period of his life was really fun.
No, I mean, like, Harvey's lived some pretty distinct intellectual lives, even though they all weave together. Like, from his early days being a Latin Americanist to studying the British Marxist historians, and now being known very well for his work on American history.
Yeah, he mentions Eugene Genovese, who is this guy who had quite an arc from during the Vietnam War, saying "Go Vietnam, America's the bad guy," and a lot of people might be like, "That's pretty based," particularly at the time period, to make the papers saying that as a professor. And then he went very Catholic and kind of pro-Confederate in an alarming way, but still doing Marxist style of very material analysis. And then he did like cultural analysis. He has a book called The Mind of the Master Class, which is very interesting to hear how they were reacting to like theological and literature and sort of debates. But anyway, so yes, Harvey has seen quite a lot.
Yeah, check out the book. We'll be talking about it at length in just a few moments. And before we get into our first segment for tonight, I do want to remind folks that it's coming up this Sunday, October 23rd in Los Angeles, California. Give Them a Revolution. Going to be joined by Anna Kasparian, Nando Villa, Danny Bessner, Ben Burgess, Jason Miles from TIR, Deep State Cuba, Varn, and Ryan Lake. It's going to be a hell of a lot of fun. Like, we spent a good amount of time yesterday sort of plotting out the live show. We got more meetings coming up. I'm actually really, really stoked on this one. Like, seeing what the plan is, the games we're going to be playing, the stuff we're going to be talking about. It's going to be a really, really good night. So if you haven't got your tickets yet, be sure to do that.
Yeah.
It's at the Telegram Ballroom.
I'm excited.
For people who want to grab some tickets, I'll put in the chat.
Yeah, I don't want to give away the program, but by the time when I get out there, I think it's going to be nice and loose, and I'm excited to have some certain conversations. So
it's going to be very loose. I'm turning 30, y'all, so come and join us.
Oh yeah.
If anything, just help me send off my 20s in style. So
that's the thing is, David's not a baby anymore. The 20-year-olds now you're 30. It's going to be, the hangovers are going to be that, like, about 50% more severe and more regular. You're welcome to your 30s, buddy.
I'm looking forward to it. But yeah, and also this weekend we're going to be releasing a think tank, so we'll put a post up for patrons to get your questions and topics in there. Keep your eye out for that as well. But I mean, should we jump into this this first story, Matt? Like, I think one of the videos that I was the most proud of that we did on Team BS was a video we did after some pretty famous now Extinction Rebellion protests in the United Kingdom, where climate activists were shutting down public transportation, which really sent a lot of mixed messages, I think, to the public. It didn't make a lot of sense to folks argue, for the main reasons like, well, one, don't you want people to be doing public transportation? And two, because this was done sort of early in the morning, you're not getting people who are going out on a Friday night to the pub or something like that. You're getting people who are trying to travel into town to work their jobs, particularly difficult period of time economically that we haven't gotten out of, where a lot of people are very precarious. A lot of people do not have employers who are going to accept these kind of things, which meant that, people are sort of getting punished for an action that some folks are taking. And, was it something that was really creating a lot of allies? Our argument was at the time, no. So I bring that up just to say that, like, in that spirit, we're going to be looking at two recent protest actions that I think have gotten a lot of attention. Is there anything you want to say before we jump into these?
Yeah, I do, and I think in the recent days, the two we're talking about, like, I think in all three cases, we're going to be talking like the Extinction Rebellion thing, the AOC Ukraine stuff by the LaRouche folks, and the Just Stop Oil soup can Van Gogh protest. I think, looking back on it now, I think you can grant a value to the whole raising the conversation talking point. Like, I think having the opportunity to go through with Joshua Kahn Russell and talk about those sorts of things as we did, I think that there's something that's not entirely invaluable. But I also think, like, we can be adult about it and talk about the different broader things and have those sort of critiques, like you said about the public transportation one. Generally, the one that I really am allergic to is the one that's just generalized as if people in general and their apathy is the problem. So like, you need to snap out of your day-to-day life and start recognizing this problem. It's like, well, what am I empowered to fucking do about it? Right? Like that. And so that's why, and it's a bit of a message that like, is well known by this point, the fossil fuel, talking about your personal carbon footprint. Like we know the road that leads us down. And so like, I think I generally I'm of a couple minds. Like I think fair enough, fine. If you want to defend the LaRouche stuff, we're saying, and we can play that. Should we play that one now, or should we play the?
Well, let's save the LaRouche stuff for later, if that's okay.
Good. So we'll start with this is the protester herself.
Wait, so like, I mean, just like in case, I think most people have seen this, but if you didn't, because we're just going to play, we're going to let the protesters like give their side of the story and their perspective on it, because I think it's worthwhile and important. Basically what happened is, two activists glued their hands to the wall and they threw a can of soup at a Van Gogh painting in the United Kingdom. And while they were sort of held up on the wall, they were shouting things like, the cost of fuel crisis is hitting people. People are going to have to make a decision between heating and eating, which I think is, out of all the things said there, is probably one of the best. But, a lot of stuff about how, climate doom's incoming, and we need action. We need action, right? And yeah, I mean, I think while there is some economic aspect to it, a lot of it is sort of like, wake up, everybody, the crisis is here. But anyways, let's let them, describe the content of the protests as they saw it.
Right.
Trusty soup can, part of my brand now. I'd like to make one thing perfectly clear. We did no damage to the painting whatsoever. I was in court yesterday, heard that there's been minimal damage done to the frame, which is repairable and replaceable, and absolutely no damage done to the painting. It was behind glass, and we never ever would have considered doing it if we didn't know that it was behind glass and that we wouldn't do any damage. I mean, literally, we were sat there still glued to the wall. They wiped it off with a bit of kitchen roll. I recognise that it looks like a slightly ridiculous action. I agree, it is ridiculous, but we're not asking the question, should everybody be throwing soup on paintings? what we're doing is getting the conversation going so we can ask the questions that matter. Questions like, is it okay that Liz Truss is licensing over 100 new fossil fuel licenses? Is it okay that fossil fuels are subsidised 30 times more than renewables when offshore wind is currently 9 times cheaper than fossil fuels? Is it okay that it is there in action that has led us to cost of living crisis? Where this winter we're going to be forced to choose between heating and eating? This is the conversation we need to be having now, because we don't have time to waste. Last year, Sir David King said what we do in the next 3 to 4 years will determine the future of humanity. So we're using these actions to get media attention because we need to get people talking about this now. And we know that civil resistance works. History has shown us that it works. I'm stood here today as a queer woman, and the reason that I'm able to vote, the reason I'm able to go to university, hopefully someday marry the person I love, is because of people who have taken part in civil resistance before me.
Okay, so I mean, I heard what you were saying, Matt, about having two minds on it. I will say this, like, seeing people feel and feeling encouraged to act and try to participate in politics, I think is a good thing. So I'm not going to jump on that. But I'm going to tell you all right now, and I think, might split the audience a bit. I'm less upset about the symbolism of the protest, though I will say for me, it's not a hit. But I'm not somebody who's really going to get worked up about it. I think that's like what the right wing is really interested in doing.
Can I just make a caveat there? Just jumping real quick. Like, I agree. Like, I think like you can argue it from actually art represents the sort of like asset that rich people and so you get attention.
Like museums are very good.
Right. Exactly. That's the other point, other side of the coin. And I think that's a coin to flip, basically. Yeah. So go on.
But what I'm saying is, like, those kind of questions, I think we're seeing how this is playing out nationally and internationally, right? Of how effective it is. And I think you can see the limits of that kind of action. Very divisive. She's certainly right. A lot of folks, or they're certainly right. A lot of folks are talking about this. It's true. But what kind of conversations are being had? I don't think it's necessarily going to be a huge success in the sense of people having the necessary conversations about climate change. And even with that caveat, right, I also think that that's a very limited goal for politics. Like, this is something that has been a part of the climate movement for a long time. It's like, what we need like awareness, and what we need the science. And the fact is that most people want to live in a safe and comfortable future, a future where not only do they think that they'll be able to live, but their children will be able to live, but also in the here and now, living in the future, in the present, that they can afford to live in. And there's been no doubt about it that over the past few years, particularly in Europe, people are facing the punishment of one, industrial policy, which is tied solely to fossil fuels, which means that when there is a crisis, like what's happening with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, people suffer. Or when there is a crisis like COVID-19 and oil production drops dramatically, people suffer because the price of oil jumps up. I say all that because, like, these are needs that people have, and you see people respond to them. So what is the solution to this crisis? Is it awareness, or is it actually having like politically viable strategies that can achieve some form of transition? And you've started to see some more movements in the United States, I think, to looking towards labor and union activity as a very, very key, crucial partner of the environmental movement, something that had been lacking for a very long time. And it's not enough today, but you're starting to see that turn, because at the end of the day, a policy like just stopping all oil permits is not going to do very much when it comes to making renewables cheaper, right? You need to have the industrial policy alongside it. Because the fact is, there's a reason that capitalists are more interested in investing in oil than they are in investing in other in other renewable sources. The IRA in the United States, which we've talked about at length, we had Donna Noor on the program, if you want to listen to that, tries to think basically like the fundamental idea, the theory of change there is that if we can make these investments more attractive to private capital, then maybe we can start to get the the movements that we need. But I think there's people rightfully have a lot of skepticism about how far, for example, Biden's IRA goes in being able to provide those things. We need state level investment in renewable technology if we want to be, moving and transitioning to a greener economy. Of course, in addition, with a just transition. But what is being argued for here would be like, we inherently understand, I think, on the left now, I hope so, why we don't support like high taxes on oil and gas, because something like that disproportionately affects poor and working people when the price of gasoline goes up. You see it. I mean, you're seeing it now as we're starting to see gas prices creep up again because of decisions by OPEC plus. There is going to be a political backlash. And is it because all of these Americans are climate change deniers? No, they're mad because the things that they need on a daily basis to be able to get to work, to be able to heat their homes, to be able to take care of themselves and their families are getting much more expensive. So any kind of policy or like transition that we want to be pushing for has to wrestle with that fundamental fact. And you see them talking about it, the just stop oil people, when they say there's a decision between heating and eating. But I haven't seen enough of a commitment in their literature to really supporting the kind of green transition that we argue for. I highly suggest, if you're just watching us for the first time, reading Matt Huber's book, Climate Change is Class War, listening to interviews that we've done with him on this, because the fact is like, yes, it is dire. And that's why it's actually really important that we get very serious about what we're talking about and what we're advocating for, because when we're talking about transitioning away from fossil fuels to renewable energy, we need to understand the stakes of what we're talking about. The stakes of them are huge. On one hand, on the level of averting climate change, which is a huge disaster and it's ongoing, right? And trying to prevent that. But then on the other side, changing an extremely entrenched global economy, and the way that we power our homes, the way that we keep the hospital lights on, the way that we get food to each other. How are we going to make sure that we're doing that in a way that isn't going to be something where working class people are going to be thrown under the bus? Because Macron wants that. The center left people are very happy for it. They're very happy to argue for this kind of green austerity. And I think if you were to talk to folks in the Just Stop Oil, they would generally agree that they don't want the punishment to go on the backs of the workers. And so I'm not accusing them of acting in bad faith. What I'm saying is that this is the fundamental concern, and we've done for years, my whole life. Climate change has been something that we've been talking about and been very worried about. And why aren't we doing something? What can we do? Right. And for a long time, the best that people could think of was like, if we raise awareness, things are going to change. Until you deal with the fact that private power prefers fossil fuel systems over renewable energy systems, prefers fossil fuel systems over systems like nuclear power, which can provide tremendous amounts of energy to people at very low cost. Until we start to recognize that and recognize that the fight against entrenched financial interests and the fight for climate change are very much attached to each other, not in some moralistic way either, not just like, oh, these evil guys sitting there, like we can say like, fuck those CEOs, I don't care about them. But if you're just hoping that one day we change their hearts and everybody's going to wake up, and things will be different, you're making a wrong analysis, because there is a reason why fossil fuel is still so heavily invested in. So I bring all that up just to say that like we have to move beyond this kind of paradigm where the fight about climate change is about, well, can we start a conversation, or are we raising awareness, and recognize that what we're talking about is waging a fight on the level of industrial production in the United States and the United Kingdom and all across the globe. And how do we do that? The way that we do that is we mobilize the forces that we have on our side, and that side is working people and the working class. Embed ourselves in the union fights. Right here in Texas, you are seeing entrenched fights by the oil and gas industry against oil and gas workers. That's a place we should be. That's a place we should be showing up and fighting with them. We have to really rethink this strategy, because great. It's brave and it's inspiring that people are willing to go and deal with like the abuse that they're going to get for going out there and taking actions. I don't want to take anything away from people who are doing that, but we've been doing that for a very long time. And you got to recognize where we are at is a result of this kind of failed, activism, spectacle first policy. What we need is politics.
Yeah, and I think ultimately, like, you widen this out to the context or put in a relief to the defund the police stuff. And like, I'm somebody who basically agreeable to a lot of the police abolition agenda. I cheat in that I consider, like, detectives to be distinct from police and things like that. I think a lot of abolitionists do. But anyway, without litigating that, the problem with the defund the police slogan, and again, I don't like to, like, even that one, I don't like to, like, always stick my oar in and say this is what you should be saying. But from just an analysis level, it's negative. And that's just descriptive of it. I'm not moralizing. It's a negation of funding, right? And just like this, it's stop oil. You're just negating. We need to have like a positive vision for these things. Otherwise, like, I mean, for all the reasons that we always talk about.
Absolutely. And again, like, if you're one, you can read my works on this in Jacobin Magazine, Why Liberal Climate Policy is Failing in Texas. You can go and read Matt Huber's work, listen to interviews that we've done with him, because these are very serious questions. And like, for a long time, I was just being like most socialists. I think climate change is real and we should do something about it. But what I think people really need to understand is that the stakes are very high. Incredible amounts of money are moving in one direction. And we have to ask ourselves, one, the question of like, how can we decarbonize? And two, also, what is that decarbonized world going to look like? And for a long time, I think on our side, I'm talking criticism of our movement, not environmentalists at large, our movement, the socialist movement, hasn't really investigated what a transition would look like. And I think that puts us at a disadvantage, and we have to really rapidly build up the working consciousness that will be necessary to win these fights. Because the fights for, the just transition is going to be hard. For example, when you don't have the rootedness in the union movement in the United States that we should, you're seeing that play out right now in the state of California, what these things are looking like. And recognize that it's really important to be looking towards the players in the game. I'm not just talking about the financial interests. I'm talking about the working class interests, the people who work in these industries, to be helping us fight and lead these transitions versus finding ways, which a lot of environmentalists have been doing for a long time. I think it's getting a bit better, but it's not where it needs to be. Demonizing people. So that's the first one. But we're doing this kind of omnibus thing on like protests in general, right? And let's get to the second one, unless you had anything else you wanted to add.
No, I think that does that. Yeah,
this one,
and like, it's funny because like I do feel a little like this position is like YouTubers talk about protesters. It's a semi awkward one, and even look, I'll give it up to the LaRoucheites. Good job for getting out there, folks.
Being outside,
and it's that's done.
Okay, so I'm gonna just, before even setting it up, let's play the clip as most people saw it, and then let's give the context, if that makes sense, Matt. So the only context I will give is this is at a town hall, one of AOC's town halls, where she gets heckled.
Congresswoman, none of this matters unless there's a nuclear war, which you voted to send arms and weapons to Ukraine. Tulsi Gabbard, she's left the Democratic Party because they're a bunch of war hawks. Okay? You originally voted, you ran as an outsider, yet you've been voting to start this war in Ukraine. You're voting to start a thermonuclear war with Russia and China. Why are you playing with the lives of American citizens? You're playing with our lives.
There will be no neighbors if there's a nuclear bomb. You voted to mobilize and send money to Ukrainian Nazis. You're a coward. You're a progressive socialist. Where are you against the war mobilization? He's telling the right truth. You have done nothing. Tulsi Gabbard has shown guts where you've shown cowardice. I believed in you, and you became the very thing you sought to fight against. That's what you've become. You are the establishment, and you are the reason why everybody will end up in a nuclear war unless you choose to stand up right now and denounce the Democratic Party. Will you do that? Yes or no? Okay, simple. Are you going to stop nuclear war? Yes or no? There is no line, because this is bullshit. None of this matters if we're all dead. None of it. You know that. Then let's take it up right now, because this is the only thing that matters. This is the only thing that matters right now. We could be in a nuclear war.
You get where it's going.
I hadn't seen that part where it's like, this is a town hall. There's a line there. You want to get in line? It's like, that doesn't matter if there's a nuclear war. Well, I agree ultimately, but there wasn't a nuclear war in the time that line existed. So it turns out you could have got in line. Like,
No.
I could go to Chipotle and be like, hey, I need a burrito bowl. There's going to be a nuclear war possibly. And none of this matters if, there's a nuclear war. So why should I pay you?
And like, we're going to get into the bigger stuff. I'm not saying this is a non-issue, but I'm also not saying that this like overshadows the right to protest or anything like that. But the reason a lot of people are really upset in that town hall and what AOC is trying to say there is that they were doing a Q&A section, and because they tried to be inclusive of people who have like disabilities who might not be able to show up to an event like that in public, they were reading out questions from constituents who submitted them via email or online, who couldn't be there in person. So what the complaint was by people in AOC there was that like, you're cutting in line of somebody who like could not be here and do what you're doing. Again, not saying that like, something like that immediately cancels out any right to maybe, say an uncomfortable truth to a politician. But I do think that context is worth knowing. Man, where to start? Well, I'm going to start. We're going to get into why this matters more, but I think it is very important for people to realize that this is not some kind of organic thing. The LaRouche people are back for better or for worse. And next week, we're actually going to have Brett O'Shea from Rev Left on the podcast. And we're going to talk a little bit more in depth about what LaRouche is. It's one of those things where like I only knew about it mainly as a kind of funny oddity that was out there. But the quick, dirty version of it is that the LaRouche movement is a far-right cult. Lyndon LaRouche started out as a member of the CPUSA, but very quickly turned to the far right and created this very fascinating and devastating, because they've are credibly been credibly accused of murder in other countries. They have sent their members to go and beat left-wing protesters with steel rods, right? Like this goes from beyond just like having odious positions, right? To actually being something that you're encouraging people to go out there and harm people in general, but also notably people on the left. I bring all that up to say we're talking about this because these folks are back. I don't think they're a major force in American politics, but they are figuring out a way to get a decent amount of attention. And at this point, people will be like, well, why are you platforming them? Blah, blah, blah. Well, it's because it's on Tucker Carlson and people are talking about it now. So I think it's important for us to come out there with this kind of information. So that's the group there. And you can see all the weird stuff. I mean, before we get into some of like, is the criticism of AOC valid, all that kind of thing. Very fascinating to be talking about Tulsi Gabbard as somebody who's like principled anti-war, who is literally just got back from a mission with the United States Army. Like, you want to talk about somebody who's like anti-war, you can't talk about the person who's going and doing missions actively with the United States.
The obvious military plant who was back in like fucking 10 years ago to the right of Obama, saying he won't be clear enough about who our enemy is, namely radical Islam. And
there's like, if you wanted to compare AOC to another politician, there's plenty. You could talk about Bernie Sanders. You could talk about, who's been very clear about wanting peace and de-escalation there. You could talk about Lula. Or you could talk about Jeremy Corbyn, somebody who has been demonized in UK media for his stance against like the war, right? Like, if you felt the need that you were wanting to have an example of somebody to maybe hold yourself up to, there are people out there who you could maybe use. But the fact that both of them mentioned Tulsi Gabbard, I think everyone shows that this is an up. But all of that backstory being brought up, Matt, do you got to give the far right credit?
Do you have to give them credit?
No, I don't think so.
Well, there's a few. Yeah, I think like it's bad to not give that context, right? I think even if you 100% agreed with even the Tulsi stuff, or even let's say they didn't say anything about the Tulsi stuff, even if that was your position that AOC needs to be stronger, and about how our military aid, how much military aid or that military aid is going to Ukraine, even if that's your position, like it's still like malpractice from my position as from a media commentator not to also give the context for that group's background, because you might somebody to think that this is a good place for me to invest my time. Like I'm ambivalent to like about the like the Just Stop Oil stuff. The LaRoucheites is like absolutely not like with the Just Stop Oil. I think it's like, well, maybe like, you know, DSA or a communist organization. Personally, um, that's my vibe. The LaRoucheites, I think it is absolutely malpractice. Like that's, you have to absolutely include that in the story, because I mean I've been seeing this for my entire fucking life. For being in undergrad and college, hearing a Ron Paul guy, you know, talk about being anti-war, and that was the first time I've heard of Ron Paul. The first time I heard of libertarians, I'm like, oh, this is kind of interesting. I don't like the war, and then you go and actually do a little bit of research about Ron Paul, and it's like, not quite, right? And if I hadn't had like a basically a developed economic sort of leftism at that point, who knows what sort of rabbit holes you could go down based on having an anti-war position. So yeah, I don't think you have to hand it to them. I think you have to warn people about them.
So, but you know, here's the rub, right? Like, so we talked about what this group is, and I think it is, yeah, as Matt was saying, it's worthwhile to recognize that these things are ops, not just in the sense um you know, not being sort of like genuine organic protesters, but also that these things are orchestrated from a group, and when they're orchestrated from a group like that, you have to ask why are they getting involved. But again, literally every time I've said something like this online recently, people, you know, get worked up and they're like, well, I support anybody who takes an anti-war stance. And I'm going to tell you right now that you don't have to do that, because there are plenty of people out there who have been advocating for de-escalation, right? Matt and myself, among them, who have been attacked very viciously for our position. Branko Marcetic, somebody who writes almost daily on this subject now, gets no love from even a lot of people on the left for his position as correct and well researched and well argued that it is. The point is that we are not in a situation where there's an absence of people who are talking about this subject. So in a moment like that, no, you do not have to hand it to the far right. Now, unless you had anything like on that, like on the actual substance of the criticism of AOC here, is it fair? Now, just my normal AOC disclaimer here. I mean, Matt, when we talk about Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, is it usually just say, hell yeah, AOC, you know, slay queen, or is it usually saying, hey, AOC seems to be stepping outside of what the Democratic Socialist Left movement is saying or wanting on this subject matter?
I'd say 2 to criticism, 1 to give her defend her, basically.
Yeah. So this is not a channel where we're spending all of our time saying you can't criticize AOC. She's the best that we have. This is we argue, in fact, not only regarding AOC, but in general, that having like accountability to like membership, accountability to the movement is an absolutely critical thing for any kind of left-wing politics. Has AOC been flawless and excellent on the question of Ukraine? No, I don't think that that's I don't think that would be correct to say. But I also think that it's very incorrect. And what these kind of things try to do is utilize the fact that a lot of people don't follow, for example, congressional votes very closely and don't know what's sort of happening in the political world other than maybe what they see on Twitter and what they see on interviews, right? And that's actually not why you send somebody to Congress. You send somebody to Congress to be able to take important votes on things and to be able to push certain positions, hopefully with a coalition, so that matters. But even if not, you know, to maybe stand up for sometimes for a voice that's being unheard. Is AOC somebody who has had her foot on the gas pedal of nuclear war in Ukraine? I think that is an absolutely ludicrous statement. Yes, it is true that AOC did vote for an aid package that went through Congress almost unanimously, that provided $10 billion to Ukraine. Around $2 billion would be going to the military, in some capacity, right? Is that is that what some folks want? You could say, maybe I don't think we should be funding any of the military. I'm not saying anything about that argument, but like, maybe that's your position. Is that amount of money fueling a result in the conflict? I think that that's a little bit of a ridiculous, immaterial argument to make, right? This is not like the critical sole funding that is basically allowing this to happen. There are a lot of factors that have went into this crisis, that have went into Russia's invasion of Ukraine. There were a lot of groups in the West in particular who are working to scuttle any kind of peace talks before, as we know now, before the war started, and lumping in AOC with those people is very, very inaccurate and unfair. And yeah, we're going to break our rules and like defend AOC a little bit here. I don't know if we want to pull this up yet, Matt, unless you had anything else to say.
This tracker here?
Yeah.
Yeah,
I might pull it up because
Aaron,
I don't know if it's just for me, but you're coming in a little blurry and it might be hard for people to read.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
That's no problem. Just letting you know. But you could walk us through it. I'll drive it.
Yeah. So, I mean, Aaron, actually, let me just share one thing real quick, David. Just this original thread where people can find this. Aaron Araf, quote tweets this tweet saying, Jesus, she's voted for every military increase, funding for Israel's apartheid, and she signs every shitty bill Dems ask her to. She's for every illegal intervention. You guys are being played, and many at the DSA know it. I'm trying to call anybody out. Oh, this person feels like 90%, but it feels like 90% of the AOC online haters from the left think she's voting on every military budget, voting yes on every military budget, when in reality she's been a consistent yo vote, and goes through the NDAs here. And yeah, I wanted, and then he links this, and I've tweeted this out and recently put it into a thread, so people can find this on my Twitter account if they want to go check it out now.
Yeah, no, and yeah, we can even put it in the show notes too if people want to check this out. It's worthwhile because again, like, there are criticisms to make about like the Squad as a political force in American politics. Have they been standing with our movement in all the ways I think that they should? No. Do I think that there also needs to be like a much more stronger rootedness in the movement? Yes. But what is not helpful is the way that a lot of these online debates happen, where basically people can just make up whatever they want and they create these really wild false narratives. So this covers a lot of important votes for the left, but we can get into some of these, military. 2023 NDA, nay, and look at that. If I know these things probably aren't showing really well, but AOC is here, nay, including the rest of the Squad. Defense spending, 2022, Cori Bush, nay, Rashida Tlaib, nay, AOC, nay, Ilhan Omar, nay, Ayanna Pressley, nay, Barbara Lee, nay, Jamal Bowman, nay. So U.S. Sanction Impact Study, 2022 NDA, National Defense. Remember, that's the military budget right there, y'all. That's like the one that everyone, should care about. Nay votes, right? Should there be sanctions on Nicaragua? No. Should there vote for the 2022 NDAA? No. Squad, unanimous on this kind of thing, right? The infrastructure bill, which I know is not what we're talking about here. You also have, the progressive vote, with the exception of Barbara Lee, right? And I'm not including Pramila Jayapal in that. I bring this up because it's like, this is important. This is not saying there's no criticism that can be made. This is not saying that there's, not things that we need to be working on. But it's really important not to allow fantastical politics, inaccurate information to cloudy your worldview. And a shitload of left-wing online media plays that game. If you took the average like Jimmy Dore listener, a lot of these other folks who are all in for Tulsi Gabbard, and you were to pull their audience, and what did AOC vote for the National Defense Authorization Act in 2022 and 2023? I bet you 80 to 90% of those people would say yes, right? And this is really, really dangerous kind of things because it does disillusion people. It does frustrate people. If AOC was out there making those votes, yes, we would be we would be extremely upset about this. But a lot of these kind of groups out here really thrive in areas of misinformation.
Yeah, a lot of these groups that again like don't mention any of these votes because ultimately and we need to talk about this too. Like it's the ones that it's the decisive, and we've talked about this plenty of times. And that's why we gave Jayapal the bum steer because of the Build Back Better thing. Like ultimately these decisive things. I mean, this shows up voting against the for the bipartisan infrastructure bill, right? Like I guess I'm forgetting a little bit where I'm going with that, but yeah, it's just it doesn't help anybody. And like if you're one of these Congress people, like you're not these people aren't giving you credit for the ones you are voting the right way on. You're going to go out on a limb for them for these fucking podcasters because they're constantly like not giving like basically rewriting your voting record more negative than it actually is. Like get out of here. Like you're not gonna they're not like they're completely what they're doing is a poison pill. Like it's for any time like any staffers that might be in those offices that might actually want to listen to the left, they come across that stuff and it's like, well, fuck you, we look at all these fucking votes against the NDAs. Like it's ridiculous.
Then we have, I just bring this up too, because it is also worthwhile to remember what's going on in the national conversation, because sometimes we can be a little insular on the left. This is from, the right wing. This is Washington Free Beacon. I just bring this up because, you have this, inaccurate view that AOC is the one who's got her foot on the gas pedal for nuclear conflict with Russia. And you have this from the Washington Free Beacon from a little while ago. Socialist Squad members defends vote to protect Russian oligarchs. Rep AOC on Thursday defended her opposition to a bill urging President Biden to fund Ukraine with assets seized from Russian oligarchs. Right, and they also throw in, other members of the squad here. I bring this up just to say that, AOC is somebody who is getting attacked from the right wing for not being hawkish enough on Russia, for being too soft, and maybe being, secretly aligned with Russian interests, right? Like that's the game that the right wing is playing. So I think it's important for us to be able to get these things right. Again, could AOC be doing a lot more in many areas? Yes. Could she be doing more on Ukraine? I think so. Is this criticism that's lobbed at her that she individually is throttling us into nuclear war with Russia? I don't think it's an accurate criticism. I'm sorry, I just do not find it to be an accurate criticism. You could say she hasn't done as much as we would like her to do on this, right? That's a conversation, that's a debate to be had. But no, that framing is nonsensical. And again, the reason why is because this isn't about educating people. This isn't about trying to build a genuine anti-war movement. It's an op by a fringe political cult that wants to get more attention for itself, and it certainly has gotten it.
Right. Yeah, and you say like, does it matter if the right wing is the one bringing these criticisms? Well, yeah, because they don't give a fuck if AOC blows her entire credibility, making a martyr of herself for this cause. Like you're not gonna like you would love that. Like simultaneously, you get to like stand up for this. Like again, like that'd be a cost if AOC did something that would massively threaten the Ukraine resistance effort. Like that would be something we as like the DSA might start getting investigated if something like that happens, right? And like fair enough if you think that's a position that like she should take, but like fucking right wingers, they win on both sides of that. So like they're not really concerned about the strategy. So that's why like yes, it is relevant, I guess, to conclude.
So that's some very topical stuff from this week. Let us know what you're thinking about it. Don't forget October 23rd in Los Angeles, California at the Terragram Ballroom. Let me put that in the chat one more time. Come and see us. This can be me, Matt, Nando Villa, Danny Bessner, Varn, Anna Kasperian, Ben Burgess, Kuba, Ryan Lake. I'm sure I'm forgetting somebody. But I've said the names enough that I think we can tease a little bit about, some of the content that we're going to be doing. We're going to be talking about what the left strategy for electoralism should be. We're going to be having a panel on identity politics. We're going to be having a panel on black pill, and a little bit of a competition to see out of some of our guests who is the most doomer black pilled. We'll also be doing some fun stuff. There'll certainly be some Peterson Rubin appearances. It's going to be a hell of a lot of fun. I'll put this in the chat right now. If you want to get tickets, come and see us October 23rd in Los Angeles, California.
And there's meet and greet tickets, and also I think we'll do a little bit of we'll meet and greet after the show too with everybody. So you be more FaceTime before the show, but come out and see us. Yeah,
we're looking forward to it. But yeah, y'all, we got a really fun post game lined up for everybody. But before we get to that, main event of the night is our friend, teacher Harvey J K, joining us to talk about his new book. Well, not his new book, the re-release of his classic book, The British Marxist Historians by Harvey J K. Talking a bit about the book, talking about how to be a Marxist historian, and the importance of history for the left. Y'all know Harvey's always electric, so I hope y'all enjoy it. Welcome back, everyone. David here, joined as always by my good friend Matt. Thanks so much for being here, Matt.
Howdy.
And we're very honored to be joined by our good friend, teacher, TMBS Forever crew, author of many books, Harvey J K. How are you doing, friend?
I'm doing great. It's good to see your faces. It really has been a while, you know. I guess I had to bring a book, even if it was an old book, brought back to get to see you guys.
Well, you're welcome anytime. I mean, we always love having you on. But we do have a special occasion, and it's this right here. We have a reprint of Harvey's book, The British Marxist Historians, out now from Zero Books. Y'all should definitely pick it up. And I mean, there's a lot I think we can get to with this text. You've sent me some of the many different versions of this book. I mean, it's made a big impact, and I'm really excited for it to be able to be re-reaching people at bookstores across the country right now. But
I can't remember. I know one evening I went to the studio for TMBS, the Majority Report studio for TMBS. Mm-hmm. I did give one of you maybe a copy. Did you get a copy of the British Marxist Historians, or was it The Education of Desire? I got a copy of Pain, I believe.
I have a copy of Pain too.
Oh, okay. Because the first edition of the British Marxist Historians came out in the winter of 84-85. And then in 96, was after several printings, one press sold it to another press, to Macmillan in the UK. It's funny, all three times it was British publishers. Maybe that's not too surprising. And a few years ago, Macmillan was letting it.
David, do you want to do this? Oops.
Yeah.
Is it? It's playing a little bit choppy.
Yeah, it's playing really choppy, Matt. Folks. Could you send it to me and I could play it?
It's something? It's on YouTube. It's on YouTube.
It says it's processing, so
you can't play it?
Yeah.
From there. Okay. Let me see. Shoot, I uploaded a while ago. Sorry about this, folks. We're going to take a little break here, and we should be back with Harvey in a second.
Okay. All right, y'all. Sorry about that. Just give me 1 second, and I think we should have it ready to go for everybody now. Apologies for the wait, but it's definitely worth it. So we need to see Harvey's beautiful face. I felt bad having him so pixelated up there, but here we go.
Yeah, absolutely. Hope I'm not hearing that, David. Unfortunately, not sure.
Okay, I got it. Just had to share audio. All right. Welcome back, everyone. David here, joined as always by my good friend Matt. Thanks so much for being here, Matt.
Howdy.
And we're very honored to be joined by our good friend, teacher, TMBS Forever crew, author of many books, Harvey J K. How are you doing, friend?
I'm doing great. It's good to see your faces. It really has been a while,
Yeah, if that's working either. I feel like I don't know if we're having a restream problem. Shoot, sorry, folks. We'll get this figured out one way or another. It wasn't working for you either, was it, David?
Yeah, it was. I think I have it fixed. I'm really sorry, everybody, for this. It's been embarrassing.
No, all good.
Okay, I think this should be able to work.
We can't just share it from like the restream.
That's what I was.
where it
That's
is
what I
now,
was
can we?
doing. That's what I was doing. But the problem was that once
weird.
I shifted it, are you seeing that? Yeah. All right. This should work. Let me just double
Test
check.
audio. How about my internet, folks?
Okay. So this should work. Right? Is everyone hearing this? With this
Oh,
text,
perfect.
I know you've
Yeah,
sent me some of the many books. Harvey J K. How you doing, friend?
I'm doing great. It's good to see your faces. It really has been a while,
It's
I guess I had to bring out a book, even if it was an old book brought back anew, to get to see you guys.
Well, you're welcome anytime, and we always love having you on. But we do have a special occasion, and it's this right here. We have a reprint of Harvey's book, The British Marxist Historians, out now from Zero Books. Y'all should definitely pick it up. And I mean, there's a lot I think we can get to with this text. I know you've sent me some of the many different versions of this book. I mean, it's made a big impact, and I'm really excited for it to be able to, be re-reaching people at bookstores across the country right now. But
I can remember. I know one evening when I came into the studio for, TMBS, the Majority Report studio for TMBS. I did give one of you maybe a copy. Did one of you get a copy of the British Marxist Historians? Or was it The Education of Desire?
I got a copy of Pain, I believe.
I have a copy of Pain too.
Oh, okay. Because the first edition of the British Marxist Historians came out in the winter of 84-85. And then in 96, when the book was, after several printings, one press sold it to another press, to Macmillan in the UK. In fact, it's funny, all three times it was British publishers. Maybe that's not too surprising. And then a few years ago, Macmillan was about to let it go. And that's when I was in a conversation with Doug Lane, the then North American publisher, really, of Zero Books. And I will say, just so people understand, it's not simply a reprint. Okay, the second edition had a lengthy preface and the foreword by Hobsbawm, which I was honored he was willing to do it. And then the new edition has a kind of a few pages of memoir, recollection of times that I spent with four of the historians I talk about. And hopefully the stories I recall will drive home the question of class struggle. That's all. Okay.
No, I mean, I think, one, it's a fascinating subject, and, the historians that you write about are really, huge intellectual titans. But I think even for somebody, who might not be, a historian by trade or anything like that, I think it's a really great, like, introduction, or, opening up for people to think about history, like as a profession, and also for how it fits into our movements. And I think that's a good way to jump into this, because I've heard you tell this story before. How did you come to the British Marxist historians, right? Because this wasn't your field of study.
No, not at all. And I'll start off by saying very clearly, and I'm going to keep this version a little short since you guys have heard it before. So I trained in Latin American studies, and I was always, a progressive, though the term back in those days was liberal, which actually carried some weight, you might say, back in those days, and with a decidedly kind of social democratic inclinations. But when I was a grad student over in England, and I had a lecturer, a tutor, we had seminars in grad school. He said to me, you know more about Latin America than any of our British students do, but you're not asking the right questions. And he posed a question for me, which really raised the question of class in my mind. And I'm sure that was the sort of push all the further to the left. Anyhow, when I came back to the States and I eventually went on to do a PhD, I went from, I always joke about it, LSE to LSU. When I was down in Louisiana, I found, not even just among the faculty there, but most American historians, social scientists back in the early 80s, just weren't asking the kinds of questions that this young, decidedly left academic over in Britain was asking. And I was really, really frustrated. My mentor was a good guy at LSU, but Marx was not his thing. And I remember going off campus and I started reading these books by Eugene Genovese on slavery, looking for some kind of model for how I could ask questions about landlords and peasants, relations of exploitation and oppression, and the struggles that emanate from those relations. And I ended up reading like his first book, The Political Economy of Slavery, then his next, The World the Slaveholders Made, and I guess the next one was the big, massive Roll, Jordan Roll. And it really did move me. And I contacted Genovese, and he said to me, whatever you're reading in social science, forget it. Okay, that was our start. And actually, frankly, don't bother to read anyone other than the British Marxist historians. I have the letter here somewhere. It was that kind of thing. He actually mentioned the names I should. And the names rang a bell because I had encountered them in some fashion, especially Hobsbawm as an undergraduate at Rutgers in New Jersey. And reading them, it really articulated for me the kinds of things that were, I won't use the word latent in my mind, but that were present in my thinking. But they showed the way in which you could read the past, and in that sense, the present as well, and make far smarter sense of it if you understand that the classic model that was being propagated, even by people who call themselves Marxists, of, you have class and you have class consciousness, then you have class struggle, was just all wrong. Okay, it was that. And I don't mean to antagonize you, David, because I know you've had this fascination for Althusser. But the problem in the 70s especially was that the structuralists were so loud and so present that really history itself was being marginalized, and the dynamism of experience and struggle. You can't talk about struggle if it's structure. You have to be also talking about agency. I mean, that's sociological talk right now. But the point is to really understand the dynamism of what we would think of struggles and politics. You really have to see it through the course of time. And that's the only way, really, I think, that they taught me to understand the significance of class struggle and how to recognize it and understand its impact. That's just, So it was really because of Genovese, who, by the way, late in life became very conservative politically. I'm not sure he ever rejected the fundamentals of Marx, but he wrapped it in a decidedly Catholic conservative kind of fashion.
So this is fascinating. The Catholic angle is always interesting, actually, with folks just sort of leave the love. But no, I mean, I think that this really gets to. I mean,
Sorry, David.
Yeah.
I just have to jump in there. The Genovese name didn't ring a bell until you mentioned that, but I've read a work by Genovese, the Mind of the Master Class. I was telling you, David, this is that really long book that goes deep into like the sort of like how like the slave owners felt about Milton and all these sorts of things. Very long book, very interesting. And like you said, like he turned into like a sort of Catholic, but he still had like was doing a Marxist analysis. Very strange.
Exactly. Yeah. And he really was a fascinating figure. And I did come to know him, and he really, in many ways, something of a mentor to me in the late 70s when the journal Marxist Perspectives was founded. I want to say it was 77, 78. It lasted for 10 really solid issues. He created both a sort of editorial board and then this advisory board. And I was honored. I mean, there I was right out of grad school, and he invited me onto this advisory board. And I was told by people over in Britain, where he was spending a year, that when he would go around lecturing, he would talk about the journal and say, this is the kind of journal that's going to bring together all these people who might even be as far away as Louisiana from places where socialists gather. I mean, it was so, and I met him a couple of times, but not at length, really. Not in any way did I come to know him like I came to know the British historians.
Yeah. Well, one thing I liked about this book, just as somebody who's read I've read a lot of Hobsbawm, Christopher Hill, particularly, and a little bit of E.P. Thompson. It's good to help me orientate myself and those guys as part of a conversation. That's really useful. But I also think it's really useful to a student, like an undergrad, first getting their bearings on this sort of stuff as a way to like understand what exactly you're doing when you're reading Hobsbawm or Christopher Hill.
Yeah, I mean, of course, as historians, if let's say a 19 or 21-year-old, sort of picks up one of these works, and you try to read, I mean, Hill is brilliant. I mean, it's just brilliant. And given your interest in literature, I assume that's a fair assessment of your intellect. Given your interest in literature, Christopher Hill later in his career, and I don't include all these later writings, he really turned to questions of literature and theater. But it didn't mean he necessarily left behind the questions that he was asking before then. And another historian who I have to send you a copy of a book, Matt, by Victor Kiernan. It was a volume I edited. Maybe I know I might have given it to Michael, but it's probably lost along the way. Poets, Politics, and the People. Okay. Don't remind me if I don't send it right away. Just send me a note. Okay. Poets, Politics, and the People. There were a couple of other British Marxist historians who I really should have included in that first volume, but they came into the picture for me later because I ran out of contract space on the book. But anyhow, so if an 18 or 21-year-old picks up one of their works, they're not necessarily going to know the kinds of questions that have framed their thinking. That is Hobsbawm or any of the others. And the other thing is, since British history is not at all a major subject in higher education in this country as it once was, they're going to probably trip over themselves trying to know what a lot of the references were. And I didn't know British history when I started the work. I mean, I created a whole library for myself as a reference tool so I would understand more details about the 17th century. And I still can't claim that I could ever teach British history. Sorry, can I just say something? Having said that, I'm reminded of, I spent an evening with Edward Thompson and his wife, Dorothy Thompson. Dorothy was also a historian, when they were visiting professors at Rutgers, forgetting the year. And we were out to dinner, and I asked Edward how he felt about teaching American students. And he said, "Oh, I love American students. They're so enthusiastic. But they ask occasionally the most stupid questions." I said, "What do you mean?" And he said, "Well, they'll ask me who the king was at any given time." And he said, "I don't know fucking kings who were at any given time." And that's just it. I mean, the history from the bottom up isn't just because he's only interested in working people. It's also by the fact that after a certain time, the royal figure, just to refer back to our prior conversation before we started, the royal figures became really, however much we may build them into the story, they were more figureheads than really, the folks in Parliament who were the ruling class in government. Anyhow, he was always fascinated by Americans' curiosity. I just dawned on me. It just flew into my head when we were talking. But yeah, so if you know more about the historians, and thank you for saying students might get a lot out of it, they'll come to see that, first of all, the fact that historians themselves work in a conversation. They work in a conversation not only in terms of past and present, but in the case of these historians, they really did enter into a conversation. They had all been members of the Communist Party in the 30s into the 40s. They were part of the Communist Party Historians Group, which really as a group helped transform the questions we all came to ask about history and also our understanding of how history is made. And when you come to understand the degree to which history itself is like a workshop, you also come to appreciate that the facts do not speak for themselves.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, in the kind of contemporary debates that they were in, they were really running up against structuralism, Althusser, and a lot of these ideas, right? I mean, like they're really pushing back on some very popular ideas on the left at that time.
Yeah, well, that's Thompson in the 70s.
Mm-hmm.
Prior to that, if we go back to the 40s and the 50s and the 60s, they're pushing against the overwhelming majority of historical scholars in Britain and in the United States, who probably would do, at least in social sciences, there was something of a debate with Marx's ghost, as C. Wright Mills talked about it. But in history, historians themselves had utterly turned their back on any kind of theory, that somehow, and why did they do that? Probably because they knew the strongest intellectual tradition, Marx, and the streams that come out of Marx, whether it's the Frankfurt School or anything else. Now, there was a price they paid in some ways for having been in the Communist Party. So, for example, these British historians, I don't talk about this a lot, but the British historians themselves underestimated the social and class struggles of the American Revolution, okay, and a lot of American history, because the party itself in Europe and Moscow had literally written off after the 30s the idea that there had even been a revolution in the United States, okay? But having said that, especially in the case of Thompson, he really was, if you like, intimately attached to American events and developments. His mother actually, I believe, was an American, in fact. And I often ask myself, if his father had been the American and his mother had been British, what great work we would have gotten by him about the American working class. But he influenced a whole generation, so it's okay.
Yeah, and you mentioned like the types of history that was written before the Marxist historians. The concepts they used are like modernization and things like that.
Yeah, and that comes out of social science. So if you look at the Cold War American social science, it really was the case that American social scientists thought they were in some kind of intellectual Cold War, okay, with European and Soviet intellectuals, okay, especially European intellectuals who themselves were Marxist or in many ways influenced by Marx. And so out of the sort of social sciencey kind of school, the question was, well, if colonialism is coming to an end, right? And you've got all these countries, and the terms were pre-modern, they would often talk about, for these former colonies who now have to enter, who might now be entering into a modernization. Okay. Now it completely leaves out, first of all, the struggles that went into securing some kind of independence. It also left out any question of either imperialism and its impact on those societies, or for that matter, neocolonialism, which was the post-colonial relationships that existed still with Europe and increasingly with the United States. And then you get to hear these British historians, and modernization, although it implies change over time, is as static and, if you like, deterministic as any kind of structuralism, because there was the presumption of things going through necessary stages, okay, which it was decidedly an ahistorical understanding, okay, of the way in which, in quotes, modern history is made, or for that matter, any kind of history is made. So indeed, against that kind of thinking, they were fighting in that direction. And similarly, I mean, if you think about it, there were traditions in Britain that fed into their work. So, for example, there was this tradition called people's history, which was the idea of writing about working people, even if it wasn't placed in any kind of class struggle or I don't like to use the word class structure until I've talked about class struggle because of Thompson's influence on me. But it is the case that there were people's historians and labor historians and others, many of whom were very much involved with either the Labour Party, Labour in Britain, or indeed one of the further left socialist parties, or indeed, especially in the 30s, the Communist Party. So there were grounds for a Marxist historiography in Britain that were not specifically imported to England, but actually rooted even in the British traditions themselves.
Could you talk a little bit about this term "history from the bottom up" and what that means?
Yeah, I can never remember because so many years I used either term. There were two terms that became popular with my generation of historians in the late 60s into the 70s. It actually goes back probably into the earlier 60s. One term was history from below, okay, which gave you the idea of, and then this other one, history from the bottom up. And I can't remember, maybe you guys could tell me, which one sounds more American to you, history from below or history from the bottom up?
Below sounds more American to me, but
yeah, bottom up sounds British.
Yeah. And by the way, just a little cute aside, there was somebody started using an image for history from the bottom up, which was like somebody's bum, actually. Okay. Which is an English expression for somebody's arse, which is then right. American for ass, right? I mean, for what we say is ass. But yeah, so history from the bottom up, okay? For generations, I mean, forever, in fact, even going back to the age of the chroniclers of the Middle Ages, history, the stories were tales or histories, eventually, of elites, whether they were royal and aristocratic elites or military leaders, generals and others, their exploits on the battlefield, or for that matter, when economic history began, the story of the entrepreneurs, the makers, as Romney would say, not the takers, So history from, we would have said perhaps in contrast, history from above was the story of those folks, okay? And it was as if everyone else was the mass, the faceless crowd, okay? And indeed, at those moments when the mass enters into history, at all in those, usually they were described as the mob, okay? The mob. And that's to distinguish them from the crowd. The British historians appreciated the term mob, but especially George Rude, one of the British historians I got very close to, he said the trick is to find out who's in that so-called mob. And what he discovered was that the assumption was that these were, to use the Marxist expression, lumpen proletariat types, okay, the sort of bottom of the barrel of the working class. He found out that they were actually often skilled artisans and even what we would sometimes think of as middle class, traders and merchants and, semi-professionals of their day. So the idea was that if history from below or the bottom up was a matter of rescuing from the condescension of history, the condescension of historians, the condescension of the elites, the folks who were very much a part of the making of history. And then to take it even further, the British historians in particular, what they were out to show was the degree to which it was these relations of exploitation and oppression, whether we're talking Middle Ages, peasants, serfs versus the lords of the manor, the landlords, or in the more, in quotes, capitalist era, working class folks, whether they were artisans or unskilled workers, the degree to which their struggles against these relations of exploitation and oppression, these relations of social production that depended on one group of people working and the others deriving all the benefits, how those struggles shaped the movement of history. And I want to be clear, it doesn't mean that there were always sort of outright confrontations. That's the big problem we all have. We use the term class struggle and we assume the banners are raised, the barricades are constructed, and the battles are underway. No, it's the idea, especially we found this with Hilton and all the way, and Thompson, arguably, that there were other modes, if you like, of struggling against exploitation. And we've come to appreciate the word resistance, Okay. And we've come to appreciate the fact that there are rebellions that don't necessarily have, if you like, grand aspirations or ambitions. They just want to reduce, for lack of a better way of putting it, the degree of exploitation and oppression. And then, of course, there are those moments in which revolution erupts. And that's it's a pretty sophisticated moment in many ways because of, ideas. There was a better appreciation, I think, of popular protest, right? Okay, and what the language of popular protest might actually be saying. So it involved, in some ways, a redefinition as well of politics, moving it from the corridors of power out into the street to see the degree to which there was a politics of the outdoors. It also involved, for example, asking questions about what social relations of production themselves entail. And I think with Thompson, the others did it, but Thompson was the most explicit about it in his attack on the structuralists in the book, The Poverty of Theory, in a theoretical way. And then especially in his work that what we've come to understand is social relations of production are not simply something that we would have previously called economic or material, but might well involve law and cultural ideas that, as somebody once said, without the police, you're not going to have social relations of exploitation. So how can you understand social relations of production if you don't include questions of law and culture and even, for that matter, the ideas that go into rationalizing systems like that? Anyhow.
No, I mean, I think this is like a really important point that you can take from those historians, and also I think you highlight well in the book, is that, like, I don't think it's fair to put on the feet of Marx himself, but like there's a kind of pop Marxism, which is that, like, history being defined by class struggle. Therein that, like, you can just put certain inputs in and then, like, society will erupt into revolution. And, frankly, we're sitting here in 2022 and, doesn't seem like that's borne out. And I think, what you get a lot from your book and from their work is, like, recognizing how to look at history and look at the way that these things actually play out, instead of this kind of more like crass deterministic thing that oftentimes gets sort of thrown at Marxists as being, just pure determinists.
Right. Well, I'm thinking now, in the 1930s, these British historians, they were young. They were probably university age, maybe 18, 19, 20, probably no older in most cases than 23, except for Maurice Dobb, who was their senior, the man who wrote the Studies in the Development of Capitalism, which in some ways frames their thinking about history, okay, this transition from feudalism to capitalism. And the fascination that they had for that question, of course, was the question in their minds is, what will the transition from capitalism to socialism look like? And are there things we can do to enhance that transition or help propel it? But in the 30s, there it was, the Great Depression, which struck the United States and Germany probably worst of all, but it struck Britain harshly as it did all around the world. Okay. On top of that was the rise of these fascist and proto-fascist movements, which emerge in Italy as fascism and take power under Mussolini, and in Germany as Nazism and takes power under Hitler. And there are other things going on like that. And one of the things that they learned, and this was the influence of another senior member of their group, an older Marxist, another member of the Communist Party, a woman journalist, Donna Tor, is that, and I remember one of them saying this very clearly to me, is don't wish for a catastrophe. Don't assume an economic catastrophe is that all of a sudden people are going to wake up and realize, the power they have. And they said catastrophe invites, as Mark, or somebody paraphrasing Mark, it's socialism or barbarism, right? And so, and that was one thing. And she also taught them, in fact, if you don't mind, I marked this because I had a feeling we'd get, I should have said to you about the history from the bottom up. She told them, and she wrote this herself, we should see that the world grasps civilization with the rough, large hand of the laborer, not with the slim gloved fingers of the noble. In other words, she wanted them to appreciate the working class as a force, okay, at least, and as a potentially radical force, okay, though already engaged themselves in the struggles that labor found itself in, but also the degree to which you don't want to wait for or wish for a catastrophe to assume that those folks will be radicalized by that catastrophe. And I think what transpired in the 30s was actually good proof of that. And if you think about it in comparative terms, however much socialists may wish he had been even more of a social democrat than he was, Roosevelt helped us avoid the barbarism. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think like it's a really important lesson, and also like this is why, you know, just making a general pitch to our listeners that, you know, studying history is really important, and understanding where your information comes from is really important. Like something that's really struck me is this point that Leo Panish makes, and we have it on video in a lecture that I really like by him, and he's talking about Lenin's theory of imperialism, and how he sort of brought that up through like Engels. And he makes the point, and I didn't know this, that, you know, Lenin and a lot of the Marxists in Europe at the time, when they were reading about the United States, they were reading American bourgeois economists who were arguing at a period of time when California had not been incorporated into the capitalist market, that America was in like a late stage of capitalism, and we needed to expand into other countries and practice imperialism in order to like shore up the American markets. Which, you know, we look at that now and it's just like that you couldn't have been more wrong when California, with its incredible wealth, is not incorporated in the system. And then you realize that this is like not a purposeful mistake, but it's a mistake that has very, very big theoretical consequences.
Well, yeah, right.
You know, for the movement. And like this is why these kind of studies are like absolutely critical. You know, not just like for the furthering of like our intellectual understanding of the world, but like for the political movements too.
Yeah, and just as a sidebar, since you brought Leo's name up, Leo was very much a student of and an heir to the legacy of Ralph Miliband. In many ways, he was the political scientist who was the closest to that cohort of British Marxist historians, and was the co-founder with John Saville of Socialist Register, which of course was the annual volume that really picked up those British Marxist historians and others in Britain and elsewhere in the world to begin a kind of socialist humanist tradition. And Leo, of course, became eventually the heir to Miliband's volume. And Edward, everyone of the group I've talked about, was very much attached to, and in some ways directly involved in that. You know, I never got to meet Leo in all the years when he might have been visiting Britain. I wasn't there, and I rarely have actually been up in Canada. But we had contact in the year or two before he passed away.
He was a real force. I got to see him one time when I was living in New York, and it was a really great experience. I've really been diving into Leo over the past couple of years. But
yeah. By the way, for what it's worth, my contribution to Socialist Register is published, I think, in the 85-86 volume, which is, and my piece was the use and abuse of history. It's all about Thatcher and Reagan and the New Right and how they used and abused the past, which of course I talked to Michael a lot about, and it became my book, The Powers of the Past. So I owe a lot to that cohort.
Yeah, I'm not sure which way David wants to go now, but I did want to bring up, you know, I'm less familiar with Dobb and Hilton, the first two writers, but there was a quote that you included from Hilton. You were out on some historical field trip, and a guy says, may I tell you about the lordship's exploits on horseback? To which Rodney instinctively retorted, no, but you can tell us if you're up to it, about how he exploited his peasants and how they may have resisted it. Yeah. And that's such like a succinct, you know, the sort of way we perform history and stage history for folks, like a succinct sort of response to it.
Yeah, that actually was a really fascinating moment. So the book was already published, as I recall, and I was back in England for this period of time in 86, 87. And Rodney had retired from Birmingham University and actually got me a fellowship at Birmingham to spend the year writing what would be my next book. And we went out for, you know, it may not have been yet that I was in residence, but we were setting it up on that trip. And Rodney said, we're going to go out for a day. I'm going to take you around the West Midlands. And we covered a lot of territory. And we went into this church at the end of the high street in was it Warwick? I want to say Warwick. Yeah,
I think that's right.
And-
Yep.
Yeah, and we're in there, and it was all, I mean, this was one of those very medieval churches, very, very medieval churches. And they had these huge, these tombs with, I'm sure everyone's seen these in the movies or in pictures, where the person who's buried inside, the Duke or the Duchess, the Lord, the Baron, whatever they were, that their figure is laid out on top. And of course, if it's a male, he's got a sword, that stretches across his torso. And if it's a woman, she's, finely dressed with some kind of headdress included. And I forget the names of these figures. Maybe I mentioned it in the story, but this guy comes over, and I don't know if I mentioned it in the book, but this guy was big. The guy who came over to ask us if we
call him a sizable fellow. Yep.
Yeah, I call him a sizable fellow. Yeah. I went, and Rodney, I mean, it was no weakling, this guy, Rodney, by any means. But I thought when this guy said that, and Rodney came back with what he did, and I thought, oh man, are we gonna get smacked around by this guy? But it was just great. I also remember just admiring his instinctive response to the bullshit rendition of history the guy wanted to present us with, and hoping that I can be that attuned. Well, I'm at that age now that Rodney was then. I'll find out if I'm as attuned, but that was really a great moment. It was just absolutely wonderful. And I'm glad I remember. Sometimes these stories occur and you forget to write them down, but that one I knew I would never forget. So
Yeah.
Hilton really.
Yeah,
sorry. You go ahead. No, go.
I want to move on to Christopher Hill and sort of what's at stake with the memory about the English Revolution. We have Charles III now. The interregnum between Charles I and Charles II is what we're talking about here, and this sort of notion that it was.
Whoa, hold on! You've reminded me of what I was thinking when he with Charles III. I thought to myself, is he really asking for the monarchy? Is he asking to be the last monarch? I mean, because I don't know if did I mention earlier as we were talking, the English taught the French how to take off the head of a king. And for people who don't know their English history, during the English Revolution, not the one that they used to call the English Revolution, that the elite historians call the English Revolution, not the, the glorious rebellion of whatever it is, 1680s. Right. We're talking 1640s when they took off the head of a king. And you wouldn't think that somebody truly, and then Charles II was nothing to brag about when they restored the Stuart. Charles III, my God. Even when I hear it now, my mind immediately goes back to the 1640s. It's just crazy.
Yeah. And I mean, the way we understand it, like you said, like Charles I, we understand it as like a Puritan revolution. They got so upset with Charles I playing footsie with Catholics that they were upset. But really, like Hill's work brings up the levelers, the ranters, all these different groups that Cromwell basically were part of that revolutionary coalition.
Yeah, that what begins as this, if for lack of a better way of putting it, the Cromwellian revolution unleashes, and that's why we underestimate quite often what may well be available to us in speaking to our fellow citizens, our fellow workers about making change happen or rebellion or resistance or whatever else. Anyhow, so this rebellion occurs, and within the rebellion there emerges this group, the levelers. And the levelers take seriously the idea of the rights of freeborn Englishmen, which was something, by the way, that was rooted in a Norman yoke myth, that somehow the Normans had come over with William the Conqueror and suppressed the rights of the Anglo-Saxons. So these levelers basically made this argument in a beautiful set of speeches, the Putney debates, I think they were, makes this argument about equality. At least the idea of political equality, okay, which is an argument in our more, sort of 19th and 20th century terms for a kind of universal suffrage, okay, that by no means should free men, be left out of these kinds of political rights. And then of doing that, of course, people started asking other questions. And then you get Gerard Winstanley, who was, for lack of a better way of putting it, the public intellectual of the group called the Diggers. And they actually said, well, wait a minute, what about property? Maybe we ought to redistribute property, or at least put property to land to better use. And they occupied lands and started cultivating it themselves. And Christopher Hill's book, did you ever read The World Turned Upside Down?
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, it's just so much fun. It's clearly a book inspired in its own way by the 1960s rebellions on of young people in England and Scotland, the United States and France and elsewhere. And then this other group, which a lot of historians refuse to believe there even was such another group, the ranters. And they came to see it, well, by no means, why does God limit himself, as they would say, to any one particular place? In some ways, they're very close to what is it called? Pantheism, I guess it is. The idea is that God is in everything. So it sort of liberated them politically, culturally, and sexually, as it was, and definitely rhetorically. And so, and by the way, one of the things I discovered in reading that is the degree to which Quakers themselves were very much wrapped up in the revolutions and rebellions of the 17th century, which of course leads on to, if you'll excuse my move there, that Tom Paine's father was a Quaker, and may well have passed on that kind of thinking and that kind of intellectual tradition to his son.
Yeah, it's very fascinating. There's a document that Hill references a number of times called Gangrena, I think it is. And it's basically an official document by, I think, the Crown, where they're sort of auditing all these different groups and the types of crazy things they're saying. But turns out that's actually really useful to historians, to say like
that. I had forgotten completely, but that's great. Absolutely great.
But yeah, I love that. So I don't know, David, is there anything you want to jump in here?
I mean, just a little valor here. My family were Quakers when they came over to this country. But no, I mean, I think that
the guy who was my mentor, by the way, for my PhD, my dissertation down at LSU, was a Quaker.
Oh, really?
So even though he may not have had tremendous sympathy for someone who now wanted to write a Marxian dissertation, he was a Quaker and very open-minded and tolerant, and would come to my defense if anyone challenged my right to do it.
The American side of it is really fascinating. But I mean, I've heard you make this argument a lot in the American case, but I've also heard you in interviews, mentioning this as well, that one of the things that you can really draw from the work of the British Marxist historians is that there's a language of struggle and in English history that the left should certainly be upholding in contemporary fights today.
Well, a couple of things. First, let me see if this helps me think this through. We really don't teach English history at all these days, okay? And nor do we understand the degree to which the English, if you like, artisan working class struggles of the 17th, 18th century were very much a part of the artisans and laborer struggles in this country in the period of the 1760s, well, for quite some time, but especially 1760s and 1770s, when you get this kind of revolutionary spirit emerging. I won't call it a revolution until Thomas Paine writes Common Sense, but this kind of rebelliousness, they believed that they had, these Americans, they were told that they were British, that they were English, and therefore they had the rights of freeborn Englishmen. What, by the way, when they become revolutionary is when they realize they're Americans and that they were actually fighting for human rights, not necessarily for English rights. Okay. But, and if that's what you mean, yeah, there is this notion of rights that the English working people believed they possessed. And when they were denied those rights, they were more than capable of crowd action. Okay. And since they couldn't vote, okay, they could attack the homes of the authorities, right? The women knew how to invade marketplaces. This was even characteristic of the French marketplaces in Paris during the revolution there, and take over the marketplace and set their own prices for things. I mean, these kind of, some people call it kind of pre-industrial protests or they had what was called a moral economy that they believed was worth defending against the imposition of what we would later call the market economy and its price settings and demands. Is that getting sort of what you mean? Okay. Yeah, no, I think, you know, it's amazing the degree to which we believe every generation, your generation, every generation does it. We believe we're well, maybe not your generation because we're suffering from this 50-year class war on working people that we seem to be losing over and over again. But we often think that we're the first generation. For example, young people believe that the first generation to have sex. It's that, I mean, to be silly about it. And what we also don't, what we fail to consider, this is going to get a little anthropological, and that I rarely go anthropological, but we forget the degree to which we're raised and we absorb things, whether consciously or unconsciously. And I once said to my students when I turned 50, which now is, 22 years ago, I said to my students, I thought about turning 50 and I realized, so that would have been 1999. And I said, if you took 5 of me and laid me head to head, we'd be back in the 17th century. And we all know, I don't know if you guys have hit this point in your lives yet, whatever you may think about your mother, your father, you're going to come to the day where you hear yourself sounding like them. Okay. Now that's exploited in that ad that says, we all become like our parents. No, I'm talking seriously, where you almost can hear their voices in your head. So why do we assume that we're not hearing? Sorry, doesn't sound as psychiatric as it may. I don't mean to sound psychiatric now, but why do we assume we don't have these deep cultural memories that are passed from generation to generation that really do give us a kind of, and I don't mean conservatism, I mean quite the contrary, this kind of radical spirit. I mean, we're not that far away from truly radical moments. Okay. Yeah. And I don't, I mean, as a consequence, we've got to learn how to tap into these kinds of things. And we need to encourage ourselves by reading about them to begin with.
No, I mean, I totally agree. Like, I just wrote my piece in Jacobin.
I want you to bring that up. Can I be the one to say that?
Yeah.
David wrote this really fine piece on cowboy rebellion in Texas about how, everyone might think about cowboys as right wingers today, and they're probably not at all, but that's the way in which we get these images in our head. But at that moment where what had been called the enclosures in Scotland and England, which drove peasants off the land, there was enclosures by these land barons in Texas. And, cowboys needed to move, and they needed to move cattle, and they needed to sustain themselves. And you put up a fence, and you're lit. Okay. So now you want to say more. I mean, it was a great piece. Everyone should go online, type in, tell them what the title of it is.
When Texas cowboys fought private property.
There you go. Right.
No, I mean, thank you so much for the kind words, but I mean, I've been very, really inspired by, speaking with you and reading your work. And, for me, it was one of those things. I read it in a book that you suggested that I read called Grassroots Socialism, which is a history of left populist and early socialist movements in Texas and Louisiana and Oklahoma. And it opens up with it's only a couple sentences just on this moment in Texas history. And I had learned it in high school, but, just like a footnote kind of thing. And I went up looking at, to read more about it. And almost everyone who's doing this, mainly like hobbyists, like Texas blogs and things like this, the way that story is always portrayed is fascinating. And it shows like the cultural, like the way that we look back at history from our own time, where it's like, this is how law and order came to Texas, right? Because the Rangers came down and put down this rebellion. And I found that to just be an absurd way to look at it, because you were much more likely to be related to a fence cutter than you were to be to one of those Texas Rangers who was trying to blow up the guys on the fence. And I think, in a state like this, that we're really fighting for like the way that we tell our history, it's really critical, not just in defense of of our history, but also defense of like how we understand ourselves as people and parts of these communities, to say, actually, like, we have a very radical tradition, and there's been a point actually to obscure that. And I think that it empowers us a lot, that, these ideas, they're not some kind of foreign importation or like other people trying to come and change these places, but rather like the continuation of a spirit of people who are fighting back against these things from the very beginning of the history here.
Yeah. If you told friends and family that populism and socialism were powerful forces in the South, what was called the Southwest of Louisiana, Texas, Oklahoma, come north, include Arkansas, Missouri, okay, Kansas. I mean, Thomas Frank, his book, whatever was faulty about the original book, What's the Matter with Kansas, was driven by his knowledge of the fact that Kansas had been a populist state. I mean, clearly a populist state. You know, I love talking to my students as Wisconsin became more and more a Scott Walker kind of state over these past, you know, more than a decade now. And before that, the Republicans were gaining in strength. We were always generally a Republican kind of state, but once upon a time they were progressive Republicans, not reactionary Republicans. How many people in Wisconsin know that for most of the 20th century, the mayor of Milwaukee was a socialist? Okay. How many know that out in the western part of the state, the rural part of the state, that this was basically where progressivism took root, that this was the state that led the way in progressivism and also took the way in many ways, social democracy as an idea. But of course, it seems so long ago, right? Although when I came to the state, I met that the last of the socialist mayors, and he was great, absolutely fabulous.
And like, I mean, I'm happy to broaden this out a bit and talk about this because, like, you know, I think on the left right now in the U.S. at least, like, there is a real tendency when it comes to history to tell a very it's like a debunking version of history where it's like, oh, you think, you know, the American Revolution was interesting, the American Revolution was reactionary, or the Civil War, which you might even think was good, they weren't doing it for the right reasons, which, you know, I don't think it's worthwhile to say we're, you know, putting our heads in the sand, not recognizing atrocities in American history. But there's a very real trend, I think, to sort of look at sort of debunking the myths and the legends without replacing it with the stories of the people and the struggles that have happened in this country's history. And I think that's a really negative thing for trying to build a movement in the long term.
Yeah, you know, as you say that, I can tell you that you mentioned the Civil War. Matt Karp, I haven't seen much of Matt Karp. I hope he's okay. I mean,
no, he's doing great.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Because really, I mean, I given my interest in the whole slave question to begin with, and my ever-growing affection for Lincoln, okay, and my sense of the ways in which slave rebellion and slave exodus helped drive the Union forces. You know, they drove to the Union forces absorbed them, and Lincoln himself literally created a different kind of army when he signed the Emancipation Proclamation. Well, I'm hoping maybe Matt's got some other project, but I hope he's writing the book that will put together the arguments he was making about the Civil War as truly a revolutionary moment in American history. I mean, many historians will grant that it's a second revolution because of the fact slavery came to an end, but he can actually talk about it as a revolution. Okay.
And all this stuff, like, this is how history can be extremely deceptive if it's not guarded against, like, basically by the project of the British Marxist historians, because you basically naturalize, like, Columbus Day just happened. And this idea that, well, nobody criticized Columbus at his own time. Don't use it. Well, actually, no. If you look at, there's documentary evidence that his sort of use of violence was a headache for the Spanish monarchy. And but if you don't include that, then you act like humanity itself condoned that sort of thing. And it's the exact same thing as, you know, with the wire cutting wars. It's like we see a lot of these I think apologists for capitalism particularly say, like, well, how many deaths are you going to need to install socialism? Because capitalism was achieved as if it was achieved without, you know, protest or violence or threat of violence. But when we all know that the exact opposite is the case, but well, we don't all know that. We need to, you know, convey to people that that's what's happening.
Yeah, that's good. By the way, that reminded me. I remember I was talking Rodney Hilton. He had invited us over for dinner. This is during the year we were living in England. Coincidentally, my wife herself was an undergraduate at Birmingham University, where Rodney Hilton was a professor, and where I had got this visiting fellowship on his behalf, you know, because of his efforts. We were standing in his study, okay, alone. I remember it was a rainy day, and we were talking about, I said to him, what if we on the left don't quite grasp how close we are to bringing off socialism? What if it's not as far away? And he said, I think I know what you're saying, but be more illustrative. I said, well, okay. I mean, we live here in Britain. Okay. It's however much there are still Tories, in the British, and that would have been in the mid 80s, and the Tories were very much in power. It still was the case that they had national health insurance. They had a whole series of things that made life radically better for working people. And I said, what if we on the left, and I meant, when I say the left, I didn't mean the Labor Party types. I mean those of us who really were socialists. What if we're not realizing the degree to which we can speak to this as socialism and build upon it? It was just something, and he actually shocked me. He said, I actually agree with you. Boom. And I always thought about that. But then, of course, this Reagan-Thatcher experience that began before 1980, honestly, but really just imposed itself powerfully in the 80s. We're now 40 to 50 years later, and it's hard even to imagine that for most people. And except Bernie Sanders, I'm not going to give him sainthood, but Bernie Sanders, to go back to something you were saying, David, Bernie Sanders pointed a finger at the billionaires. When's the last time, and you're going to be shocked when I tell you this, the last person to do that kind of rhetoric, you're going to laugh, was Harry Truman in the 1948 election. Yeah. I'm not going to go into the whole story, but he did. He spoke just like that in the 48 election. Whether he was driven by Wallace's campaign or not, doesn't matter. He spoke like that. And now Bernie is doing everything in his power to promote this working class insurgency we're seeing the beginnings of. I wish he had tied those together so that instead of just the populist pointing the finger at the billionaires, he had made it clear that the billionaires are the reason that the working class is enduring what it's enduring. Okay. And it's like, those are the kind of things because
it was close, but it was like inequality, it's like they have good stuff.
They have enough,
you don't,
yeah.
Which is,
they have enough. Yeah. We should be able to tax them. What about, I mean, I know that Bernie at times did exactly what I just said, but I wished when he took the stage, he made it explicit, because young people were waiting to hear that kind of thing. And I can tell you, a hell of a lot of working class people were waiting to hear that kind of thing. And I just today, I keep thinking about the fact that the Democrats may lose badly in Wisconsin. We may break even and win. Who knows? But it is the case that we ask ourselves, why is it that the working class has moved, the white working class has moved, well, Latino working class possibly too, is moving towards the Republicans. I mean, these people are reactionaries, and I may not have wanted to use the word back when Michael was alive, but fascists. Okay. It's really getting that bad. And you don't have to agree with me. The point is that they were so antagonized and alienated by the Democratic Party turning its back on the working class for so many years, right? That Bernie was just like that, was tapping into this deep memory I was talking about before when he spoke. And one could ask themselves even now, well, why is it that they haven't sort of woken up, to the reality? Well, they don't have to wake up. They know damn well they're being exploited. But what are the Democrats talking to them about?
Yeah, no, it's been really frustrating to watch the campaigns here in Texas, where people were, very excited about the fact that a lot of folks have moved here, and like don't want to undo the work that like Democratic Party failure has done in places that reliably voted Democratic for generations now.
Yeah.
And instead of like showing up to those communities, like one materially, but honestly, just like politically, in the sense of like putting up a ad or a billboard or somebody on the street out there. It's very scary, honestly, when you see what the right wing is able to do in that failure. It's a very dangerous thing to have the Democratic Party as it's currently constituted as like the stewards between us and like the full-on barbarism.
Have either of you seen the movie? What's it called? Was it called Hell and High Water or something like that?
Yeah, that's that's one of my favorite movies, actually. Yeah, it's one of my favorites.
That is that has got to be the film of it's a class war film.
Yeah.
Okay? And there's that moment. I can, since you've seen it, you know, there's that moment where he's driving, and I don't know, coming out of a town or into town. There's a billboard. There's this billboard having to do with, I can't remember the billboard now. All of a sudden I'm blanking, but there's so many signals in that film. That film was about the kind of stuff we're talking about, that alienation. And I know that's an old-fashioned term, but I do mean alienation, turning off to the point where they were willing to vote. It's not a matter of voting against your interests. You don't know who the hell's representing your interests. You just want to punch somebody. Yeah. And we're now at the point where the anger has been just sustained for so long that I'm not calling for, I don't want a catastrophe to do it. We blew our catastrophic moment, if ever, in 2008, 9, and 10. Okay. And it's just striking that the Democrats, they just don't want it. They're afraid of working people. That's all I can say. They're afraid of them.
It's truly, and rebuilding after that level of the Democratic Party won, being afraid of working people, which I think is true. And then trying to work with people there's been a big push to, build stronger connections with the union movement here and the left. And I think that's exactly what we need to be doing. But it's also difficult because you're inheriting a lot of distrust that even though the left ourselves aren't the ones who were, we're not in the Democratic Party or whatever, you still have to sort of overcome, people have been coming around and promising folks a lot of good stuff. And having no intention to deliver it for a very long time.
I'm laughing through my tears right now.
But it's really unfortunate. It's that's why we needed to have. I think that's why having a little bit more rootedness and showing up for people in those struggles that might not necessarily be radical revolutionary struggles, but just basic things when Exxon is locking out union workers in Beaumont, Texas. Having us have a presence there, I think, is really important.
Yes, absolutely.
To do.
Absolutely.
Well, I think we got to wrap up, but I did want to ask you. Sorry.
There's just one thing before you give your wrap up thing, but I did really like.
Just so you know, you guys want to have me back anytime? Just
we should definitely do this again.
We'll do it again soon. Yeah. Okay. I liked the bit where those guys. I'm not sure which one of them you were talking to, but told you to stop writing about us and start writing about American history, because we know you first through your American history, so it's funny to see hear the young Harvey get scolded by these guys.
Yeah, I was young, and I can tell you at various times, I think every one of them told me that. Okay? I think the first one who did was it might have been Hilton. And then maybe Thompson, and maybe Christopher Hill might have been more gentle when he told me. Okay, but I will tell you, this is funny in that sense. I now understand. When I was living in England that year, 86, 87, one of the greatest ever American labor historians, David Montgomery. Does that name ring a bell with you guys? Mm-hmm. It was just an outstanding labor historian who was really very close to Thompson. In fact, I have to say something about David Montgomery, really picking up on Thompson and others. He did a book, I think it's called Workers' Control in America. And it wasn't about, an image of the possibility of workers' control. His argument was that he had worked in a steel factory in Pittsburgh, I think before the PhD, and he was an organizer. And he said he saw in the solidarities created in the workplace among workers that the makings of workers' control, and possibly on a grander scale, social democracy and socialism, were already present in the experience. Okay. If you get a chance, read that book, Workers' Control in America. It's pretty limited number of pages.
That sounds great.
Okay. And so anyhow, I first met David Montgomery at E.P. Thompson's home in Worcester, England. And we later became friends. And I sometimes wondered if he made it. This is funny. I'm inventing a story, but it'd be great to sort of spin it out, which I'm going to do now. So Edward said, I got to get Harvey to pay more attention to his own history. He invites me over to spend the afternoon with him and David Montgomery. And as a consequence, I get to know David Montgomery. Wow. So you can see where I'm going with that. Okay.
Oh, that's great. Well, last question, because it's something I want to ask, and we've touched on it a little bit in here, but like one thing that I do really like about the book is the presence of like these outside influences, like things that aren't just like history on people's history. And I was wondering if you wanted to talk a little bit about how things like, you know, you mentioned before, like poetry and literature are very important things for historians to get into. And if you don't mind me asking on a personal level, if there's any outside influences that, you know, you utilize from time to time to sort of inspire you when you're doing work like this.
That is a boy. We could be here for another stretch, because I will confess that I'm not. Let me start off by saying Victor Kiernan, whose name I mentioned before, whose volume I put together 3 volumes of his articles into different books. And I just remember being blown away by his encyclopedic knowledge and ability to write. Well, when I was doing Poets, Politics, and the People, and I was putting it together for him, I wrote him a letter, and I confessed to him that I rarely, it had been a long time since I read literature and fiction. And that but I did so when I was working on a period of history, whether it was British, American, or for that matter, when I was very deeply involved in Latin American studies, and I could read Spanish very fluently. And he said to me, you know, he wrote back to me. I have, again, a letter here. He said, you know, Harvey, I can understand not reading philosophy, not to upset either one of you guys. Okay, I can understand not reading philosophy because everything that philosophers have written of consequence can be reduced to half a page, and that was probably what Marx wrote. That's what he said. But a historian without literature is like a man without a shadow. And I'll tell you, that has stuck with me, and it haunts me. In fact, I can't tell you why, but there are works that matter to me a great deal. And I can tell you that it may seem very remote to say this, but the book that I will always cherish is by an Englishman, T.H. White. It's The Once and Future King, which I know sounds utterly removed from all of this. But the book is really, it's not simply the story of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table and Guinevere and all. It's not, it is all of that, which makes it rather exciting to read. But it's also about the question of justice. And I think that that's one of the things that just has always stuck with me. The other thing is that, you know, there are poets that I've come to discover, in good part because of E.P. Thompson, because Thompson wanted to be a poet. And there was an older historian, not as old as Edward, but older than I am, who wrote one time, I think it's in the book somewhere, that the original meaning of poet was intimately tied to the idea of the chronicler and the historian. And in his own way, Edward continued to be a poet, even though he became a historian. And in that sense, I want you to know that if you look at his famous quote, okay, am I taking too much time?
No, it's perfect.
He writes this in the preface, I think it is, of The Making of the English Working Class, one of the greatest works ever in history. I am seeking to rescue the poor stockinger, the Luddite cropper, the obsolete handloom weaver. These are in quotes, much of this. The utopian artisan, and even the deluded follower of Joanna Southcott, who was a mystic, from the enormous condescension of posterity. Their crafts and traditions may have been backward-looking. Their communitarian ideals may have been fantasies. Their insurrectionary conspiracies may have been foolhardy. But they lived through these times of acute social disturbance, and we did not. Their aspirations were valid in terms of their own experience. And if they were casualties of history, they remain condemned in their own lives as casualties. What I used to do this little experiment. If I had my students read any of these works, and as I said, I wasn't teaching British history, I was teaching historical perspectives. I would ask them to take that, and because it was strange to them, and put it into poetic verse to see if it would help them understand it. And they actually said, you know, Marx wanted to be a poet as well.
Very bad poems, though. For being bad.
Yeah,
his poetry is very bad.
Right, he was in love, man. He was a young man. He was in love. But there are poets that I think are outstanding, and I would tell any American leftist, if they want, however corny it's going to seem, read the poetry of Langston Hughes. Okay, and if you guys haven't done it, read "Let America Be America Again." It's far more radical and progressive and class struggle, intimate with the class struggle idea than almost any poem I can think of in American history. Okay. And I would also tell people, however much it seems remote, I think Whitman, I mean, it's incredible, Whitman. And read his prose as well. Whitman wanted to be Thomas Paine, and he was going to do it through poetry.
Interesting.
Oh man, well that's perfect, Harvey. I mean, it's always such a joy having you on. Let's do it again very soon. Folks, grab the British Marxist Historians online. You can get it at Bookshop or get it from Red Emma's. Really, thank you so much, Harvey, for joining us today.
Thank you. And I'm going to say one last thing in closing.
Yeah,
I know you guys because of Michael, as we all know. And I always used to say to Michael, I would turn to him. I think I said it to you. I said it in public sometimes on the show. I said, where the hell did you find these guys? These guys are incredible. Okay. And I meant you two guys. I thought, your economic reports that you used to do were just brilliant. And I just was always, I marveled at Matt's, first of all, his technical, expertise, but also his affection for literature was pretty evident. I knew when I arrived in the studio with you guys, it was going to be a great night. I always knew that. And I'm really glad you guys have stuck together. It's great to see you.
Yeah, we have to figure out a way to have this all in the same room doing one of these in the future.
Yes, please.
Down in Texas, right?
Yeah, let's do it. I'll take you around. Well, thanks so much, Harvey. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. Hope to see you again soon.
Thanks, Harvey.
All right, y'all. Always a treat having Harvey K on the program. His book really excellent. Y'all should check it out. I mean, if that wasn't enough of a preview, like not only is like looking at the work of the British Marxist historians very important, like even if Britain isn't like the focus of your interest, I mean, they're very important ways of not just telling history, but the way about thinking about history. And I think Harvey does a really great job at sort of, making that clear for folks. Yeah, we always love having Harvey on. We'll definitely try to get him on again soon.
Yeah, we need to.
Well, yeah, folks, we'll pop over to the post game. We got some fun stuff. Matt's got a new guy. Just dropped in Minnesota.
Well, Dan Jensen, I can't remember if we've talked about Dan Jensen. He's sort of anti-vaxxer. He's one of these Republicans that turned really shy about how anti-choice he was after the Roe decision dropped. So we got some pretty funny clips to him. You're very funny, actually. These are solid choice clips. I feel like the Georgia. I didn't watch it, but from what I hear, the Georgia Senate debate was a bit lackluster. Warnock wasn't really swinging and playing a little bit defensive. But you want to check out this Minnesota guy.
And we also have, I want to say exclusive, but it's not exclusive. We have obtained some very, very interesting stuff from a gathering of some of the weirdest people in the country. The LaRoucheite Green Fascism Conference in New York City. We have some footage from that we'll play for y'all and hang out. And as always, we'll be taking questions from the chat, your voicemails at 1940-289-7234. And you get access to all that, patreon.com/leftreckon. And then last plug, I mean, come see us in Los Angeles. It's going to be so much fun. We're going to be at the Telegram Ballroom October 23rd. Meet and greet before you and get your ticket. Like, people are scalping the tickets, we found out.
Yeah.
I don't know what's going on, but also make sure to buy them from the Telegram Ballroom website, because apparently there's some third-party sellers out there that have some pretty insane markups.
The price up. Yeah, like double the price, which is
so come see us. Ben, Jason, Miles, Anna Kasparian, Nando Villa, Daniel Bessner, C. Derek Varn, Kuba, and Ryan Lake. It's going to be a hell of a time. So hopefully see y'all on Sunday, and the rest of y'all join us over at patreon.com/leftreckon and hang out with us for a bit. See y'all.
Peace.